in Pulp Fiction, there's a moment where the Bruce Willis character goes to buy some cigarettes, and he says to the bartender, he says, "1 pack of red apples." And the bartender says, "Filters?" And he says, "None." And that's just a really cool, fast, interesting exchange there, as opposed to 5 lines to explain what brand of cigarettes he wants. And, oh, you know what? How about no filters in those cigarettes, you know? Because it's very noirish feel. It's very, you know, clipped and dark and tight. And it's just filters, none. And that just gets the idea across.
Said Claude Rains in Casablanca says to Bogart, he says, what brought you to Casablanca? And Bogart says, the waters. And Claude Rains says, it's a desert. And Bogart says something like, I was mistaken. I was misinformed. Which is great dialogue, just great dialogue. Music, it's music, you know, which is the difference between speak like we're doing here and
interesting dialogue.
And interesting dialogue.
Good writing, good script, the scripts that command attention is with an extraordinary capacity to engage your reader. And that's usually through really smart dialogue.
The biggest problem with dialogue is that writers often make it carry the burden of the story. When what you want to do is you want to tell the story visually. We're screenwriters, not speaker writers. There's a reason for that. So you want to tell the story visually and use the dialogue as icing on the cake. Once the dialogue doesn't have the burden of telling the whole story, the dialogue can be fun. I mean, it's still giving us parts of the story, but it's not carrying the whole story. So, you know, if you watch a movie and look at a great movie, often great movies have so much stuff that is dialogue free. I think it's Billy Wilder who did this, and the story goes to Billy Wilder, who is a great German screenwriter, came to the United States when the Nazis took over Germany, and was sleeping on Peter Lorre's couch, like many screenwriters. Quentin Tarantino was sleeping on Scotty Spiegel's couch, and Scotty Spiegel got him a screenwriting job so that he could get him the hell off his couch. So Peter Lorre wanted to get Billy Wilder the hell off his couch, and hooked him up, went to Paramount Pictures and pitched him as the greatest visual storytelling screenwriter. And so they had a scene, and I want to say it's in Dodsworth, but I could be wrong, where it was a 10-page scene where a husband and wife have a argument, and through the argument we find out that their relationship is no longer romantic or emotional in any way. They're just two people that live in the same house. And so there's 10 pages of dialogue, and they needed to cut it down, and Billy Wilder turned that into a half-page scene. And the half-page scene was husband and wife on the elevator of their building. Husband's wearing his hat, wife's got her purse clutched to her chest. Doors open, pretty woman gets on the elevator, husband takes off the hat and smiles at her, you know, and the wife basically takes a step away from the husband. That scene gives us pretty much all the information that the thrill has gone from this relationship without all that dialogue. And so always be looking for the scene that can demonstrate what's going on in the story rather than tell us through dialogue. That doesn't mean you have to get rid of dialogue, but it does mean that the dialogue can now be something else, can now have fun.
First thing you have to understand about dialogue is that it's got to be connected to the character's desire line in the scene. In other words, if a character has an objective, an intention in the scene, the dialogue has to match that intention. And what I see a lot of times, especially with exposition and information, is that a character is saying all that information, and you can tell that it's really the writer's objective. In other words, the writer wants the audience to know this information because they think, okay, the audience needs to know this and this and this and this, so the character is going to say this and this and this and this. And that doesn't work because scenes and dialogue are about a character's intention in the scene. Everything a character says is matched to what that desire line is. So anything that doesn't belong to that doesn't fit. And you can tell whether it's the writer wanting to know that information, wanting the audience to know that information, whether it's part of the character.
One good trick is to try and keep your sentences as short as possible, which forces you to write in a punchier fashion. That's something that I guess I learned from my journalist father. Although honestly, I tend to break that rule a lot, so I'm probably a bit hypocritical there.
Writers are constantly have a great line at the end of a scene, but then they add a couple of more lines. They're insecurity lines, I call them. So we instantly just cross them out because they already had a great line. That's the end of the scene. And yes, everything hasn't been quite wrapped up, but that adds energy. When you cut that, you're pouring energy into the story. When you leave it there, you're sucking energy out of the story because the audience is like bored through those last two lines and going, "Why did we need that? I'm out of it at, you had me at a low," kind of,
You don't need that beginning sentence. You're saying the same thing in repetition 2 lines from now, and really getting concise down to the point of having, or overwriting where characters say something and you say it would be better if they just had a reaction. I always try to err on the side of let the actors act and emote rather than say something. If you see someone's eyes 60 feet on the screen, that's going to say a lot more than a line of dialogue, So you cut. They say cut the dialogue and then cut it 20% more than that. And you're like, oh, lean. And no one wants to but I've read screenplays that read like a stage play. And you're like, that's not what this is. Or scenes, every director I've worked with said, give me something to shoot where the scene is just flat and 2 people sitting. Now Quentin Tarantino can do it with interesting dialogue, with 10 pages of dialogue, but 2 characters sitting in a dinner scene, the directors I worked with, they hate it. They're like, what are we doing? It's just this, and plus the food, it will be spoiled. It takes a long time to film it,
There's an old rule that you enter a scene as late as possible and you leave it as early as possible. And you make sure that you hit the main point of that scene. And if you keep that in mind, that will also tend to focus your dialogue.
Cut to the chase, what's going on? Less is always more, is you know what I mean? And I've always found that, and you find, a producer I worked with, he caught the repetition in dialogue and I didn't even see it. And he said, you're saying the same thing here again, we don't need it. I'm like, oh my God, you're right. And he's a big anti-repetition, producer. And I've never had that before. A producer would point out those specifics. I go, you're right, I've got this bad habit now of not even seeing it. And so now I'm very cognizant of that when I work with him and in general that, we only have so much time on the screen and so many pages. And if you don't like the constraints, then write a novel. You can do whatever you want. But if you like the screenplay format, you have to have these dense, packed scenes with subtext, but not go on for 6-8 pages. There's a rhythm to it. You have a feel, like you say, when you start reading that a script's overwritten, you just know everything's described, and the writer's so afraid to let go that their vision or their ideas won't come through on the page. Well, once they take that script and make it, but you want to, your imprint is the script. So, all these other little particulars are not going to help when it's overwritten.
In listening to how real people talk, it doesn't mean you're transcribing it exactly. People don't talk like they're in a movie, but so there is a certain amount of, dramatic license that you have to use. But you can write too cinematically, you can write too theatrically and too much like your characters are on stage, and that can come through on the page, and that can really hurt your script.
I mean, what I do is I tend to be the hero. In the first Sharknado, I didn't know Ian Ziering was going to play Finn. So that character was just me. What would I do if I were thrown into this insane situation? And so then I write as my ideal self. What would I like to say in that situation? What would I like to do? Because in everyday life, we all have these moments where somebody says something to us and we just go, and we don't know what to say. And then 10 minutes later, it comes to you what you should have said to that person. And the beauty of screenwriting is you can wait 10 minutes until you figure it out and then write it down.
To write a good line of dialogue, sometimes it'll take me 3 weeks, and then 10 drafts later, I'm still tweaking that comeback. Think about it as you have a fight with your friend, and then you sit there in the shower kind of replaying that, and you keep coming up with
I should have said
I should have said that line.
Yeah.
Like, that's what movies are. The writer has gotten that perfect response. So you have this perfect back and forth repartee that real life never has. If people in real life talk the way they do in the movies, these would be crazy people. But in the movies, it's okay, it's expected, in storytelling. So the idea of everything being honed to be entertaining, to be compelling, to be a feast. A story is a feast as opposed to just running through the refrigerator, open the door, and grab a few things. That's real life.
Some of the keys to good dialogue, people want to have natural sounding dialogue. The problem with natural sounding dialogue is if you were to go, I took a class once where they said, go record people in the wild. So I went to a mall and recorded people. And what I got, the most interesting thing I got was a guy who spoke entirely in belches. And you could understand him. But what happens in the wild, humans in the wild, when we speak, we talk and talk and talk and never get to the point. And that's a problem, is in real life, real dialogue seems to never go anywhere. So what we don't want is real dialogue. We want something that appears to be real dialogue. And that means we're going to craft something so that it sounds real. One of the ways to do that is to have characters misunderstand each other. Because bad dialogue in movies is when every character knows exactly what the other character is thinking when they say that. In real life, we don't know what the other character is saying. So if you say, I'm sick of your job, I'm sick of you working your job, we may hear, I'm sick of you, and respond to that. We come up with our response sometimes before the end of the sentence. So misunderstandings occur in real dialogue, and we create that. I have a USA Network movie called Hard Evidence, which is only memorable because it was released on video after showing on USA Network 1,000,000 times on the same day as a Julia Roberts movie called Something to Talk About. Both came out from Warner Brothers, and my movie outrented it in the nation. And I have no idea why, except I did also see the Julia Roberts movie, which wasn't all that high. But one of the things that happens in that script is it's about a guy who cheats on his wife. And while he's cheating on his wife, his mistress says she sells medical supplies, but actually what she is a drug courier. And in the course of the story, she asks him to carry the gun to their meet because she usually goes with her boss. And don't worry, my boss has been there 1,000,000 times. The gun always stays in the pocket, never comes out. They go to meet, do the exchange, and the guy they meet pulls out a badge and says, I'm with the DEA, you're busted. And she says, shoot him. And he goes, shoot him? I can't shoot him. And basically she says, he's just claiming he's with the DEA, it's not real, shoot him. And so she eventually helps the husband shoot the guy. And then the husband has to go home to his wife and pretend like nothing happened. And so he's not just covering up the mistress, he's now covering up the mistress and the murder. Well, the wife thinks the husband's acting strange and decides to follow him, and follows him as he goes to meet his mistress because he's freaked out about this whole thing. Goes to talk to the mistress about it because she's the only one he can talk to. He can't talk to his wife. So the wife sees the mistress, puts 2 and 2 together, and confronts the husband and says, I know that you're sleeping. Confronts the husband and says, I know what you did. And he's like, then you're sleeping with this woman. He's like, whoo, it's only the mistress. And so she basically says, you're going to sleep on the sofa from this point on, or, we're breaking up. So he goes down, they get into an argument. He sleeps on the argument. He's the one that cheated. So he's sleeping on the sofa, and the wife comes in one morning while he's in the kitchen and says, this is after a period of time has passed, and said, that sofa can't be too comfortable. What does he think she means?
Oh.
He thinks she means, you can come up to the bedroom again.
Right.
So he says, so are you saying I can come up to the bedroom again? That's his misunderstanding. She says, no, I'm calling my lawyer, we're getting a divorce, you got to be out of here by sundown. So by creating that misunderstanding, it seems real.
Right.
So think about how to create misunderstandings where one character hears things different or hears what they want to hear. and then they respond to what they want to hear, and then they get the twist in there is the reality. So dialogue can now play. You know, when it's not carrying the burden of the story, dialogue can play, dialogue can go down tangent places, characters can say more amusing things.
A lot is said without being said at all. There's always that, you know, and subtext is very important in your writing. So you're not just, you know, it's not just the dialogue has like some depth to it, and what they're saying is not necessarily what they mean. You know, they're saying A to really mean B because their intention is C. You know, there's that. So there are different layers to the dialogue, and sometimes honestly you don't know about that until you write it and until you look back on it and say, wow, that was kind of interesting, or like that speech didn't really go in the direction I thought it would, and yet it's kind of an interesting twist, you know. But you just try to make it real. You try to make it the way real people interact in real situations. If it's that kind of, certainly if it's that kind of movie.
You can learn a lot about how people speak just by sort of listening, like listening in coffee shops to how people talk and stuff. People rarely are very self-reflective. People rarely say exactly what they mean. People rarely talk in complete sentences. And so, you know, the words we choose, when you think about when you go to say something, there's probably 100 different ways you could think of to say it. Why are you choosing the particular way you choose? And when you start to think like that, and why your character is choosing to say something that way, and what they really don't want to reveal, like why will they go to this length but they won't go just a little bit more vulnerable? When you kind of understand that about your character, then I think writing the dialogue becomes easier. But you have to put that thought process into it first to know what they want to conceal and what they want to give, I think. And then you can start working with the subtext and all that kind of stuff that makes all of that flavor kind of come out.
Subtext generated in probably two ways. One is if the topic of your scene is, why are you cheating on me? As it sometimes is, say, with Harj and Carol. You have them talk about anything but that in a way and in a context. So Harj and Carol talking about their marriage whilst Therese is in the other room and overhearing things. You do it in that way. You go off point of a conversation. You have a conversation about how difficult it is to repair the damn plumbing or whatever. And you do that in order to make your point very clear, which is, damn it, this is wrong. All of this is wrong. And the other way, which is really one of my favorite ways, is to just describe behavior in a certain context. So Carol and Therese riding in a car. What is she looking at? What is she doing? What is this? What's actually going on? And none of it has anything to do with, I don't know, camera angles or anything like that. It's just about what's happening, which is the basis of all drama, whether it's a screenplay or a play. How people inhabit a space at a certain time. That's it. It seems almost laughably simple or easy, but it rarely makes it intact to a screen in the way that this has, enhanced greatly by the mise en scène and the performances and everybody in every department just working to preserve a fundamental truth about a piece of material.
Ultimately, it is about a character wanting something, right? Every story is about a character wanting something and then facing a conflict to get it, whether they get it or not. So when they want something, they have a desire. That desire is expressed through subtext. If I want this glass of water, I'm going to take the action, right? So the subtext is that you can infer I'm thirsty, or I'm looking for some sort of like physical distraction to keep my hands busy or something like that.
And the gulping is part of that too. Maybe,
sure.
Maybe there's, I'm about to confront you on something.
Yeah, sure.
You know, or I'm your boss, or you know, whatever. ex-girlfriend. I mean, there's just so many things, and
Yeah.
you're like, ooh, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
What's she gonna say to me?
So a lot of that is about interpreting. We are guessing what a character wants from the behaviors they're exhibiting, right? Now the context is simply the worldview, the situation they're dealing with, right? So we're sitting in a room right now. We all have different objectives, and so when the character, so the context is literally just like the plate that you're serving everything on. I compare it like visually. I came up with the metaphor of creme brulee. I just used a visual metaphor where you've got the plate as the context, and then you've got the brulee or the creme or the cream as the subtext, and then the top layer that's burned and scorched, bruleed, is the text.
Oh, that's great.
So the idea is basically what we're seeing is words, right? And those words often are in complete contradiction of actual intention, but in some way we're interpreting those words as a kind of behavior. So most of the time, like for example, it's part of the reason when I'm writing, the last thing I do is write dialogue. That was another thing I learned from Ron Mita. You want to be able to, well, do it however you want. But for me, I like to have the characters' intentions very clear and the conflict that they're going to be facing very clear. And what we're constantly trying to do, there's this one book called Character and Viewpoint, where it talks about how essentially, you know, we're all like chimpanzees in the wild, and when they're in the jungle and they sense that there's a threat, they run away. And the first thing they do, as soon as they feel like they're safe, the very first thing they do is they stop, they turn around to see where the source of danger is. So that's when they're completely engaged. The whole chimpanzee metaphor is basically that we're trying to interpret the intention of things that are around us. So we're projecting what we think that person wants by the way it's behaving. So we're trying to determine whether it's a threat or whether it's safe, whether it's one on our side or against us, that kind of thing. So ultimately what we're looking for with dialogue is we're trying to see if we can believe them. And the most interesting characters are completely unaware of what's actually driving them. You know, like they're, the whole time, like Indiana Jones is going through all of these ridiculous hoops, not really, like the whole time we're wondering, like, why is he taking on these Nazis? Why is he being dragged by a chair just so that like something can make it into a museum? Ultimately, he has this really, you know, stuff that depends how deep you want to go with Indiana Jones, but he has this kind of drive to, it's genuinely emotionally upsetting to him that there would be some betrayal, some misrepresentation of the truth. And that's what's interesting is, so like the whole time he's making all these really bold choices, you think he's kind of this glib, sarcastic professor, but what he's really doing is he's trying to unearth truth. And he's literally putting his body under all his brutality because he wants the truth to be revealed. And that's, you know, and every single choice, you know that because every single choice, whether he admits it or not, has led toward him exposing the truth for what it is.
The other thing about good dialogue is that it beats around the bush. Nobody ever comes right out and says something. Instead, what they do is they hint at things.
Right.
And so that ends up being subtext, and subtext is dialogue plus action. It's never only the dialogue usually, it's dialogue plus action. So if I am sitting in a cinema seat and there is and my line of dialogue is, can I sit here? Is it okay if I sit here? That line of dialogue changes meanings if it's a gigantic, huge, you know, ex-convict with tattoos all over them, or if it's an attractive member of the opposite sex. But the same line of dialogue has two different meanings there because of the situation. And one of the things we want to do is, again, that's the dialogue's not carrying the story there. It's part of the visual, and the verbal is a movie. But characters often hint around at things and never come right out and say them. And that's good dialogue too, because if you think about characters as like, I like to think about it's a first date. You're on a first date. You aren't going to immediately ask, so, you ever been married? You divorced? Instead, what you do is say, well, how do you feel about, something that seems neutral, and it's the neutral way to get the information.
Right.
You ask questions like, you never ask, so how do you feel about equal rights and responsibilities, when really what you want to ask is, you just ordered this lobster plate, it's going to max out my credit card, could this be Dutch? You sort of hint around at things, and that's how people really talk, or at least that's what seems real on film, is if characters don't come right out and say things, if they hint around. And that again comes with, once they hint around, the audience either knows or does not know what the reality is. And so we get either we're learning information from how they respond to the hints, or we already know information and we're going, they're trying to hide this information. We all have our hidden agendas, no matter what it is. If we're on the first date, our hidden agenda is learning as much about that other person as we can to figure out if there's going to be a second date. And so we're always trying to feel out the situation by sort of trying to find the neutral question that gives us the information, if possible. So we may not come up with a direct question, we'll find the indirect way to find that information. So that's like a subtext element thing.
Take a simple line. Go ahead, drink it, right? So go ahead, drink it is the text.
Okay.
We can add different subtext to it. So if I say, go ahead, drink it, there's a different subtext. I'm maybe threatening you.
Right.
If I say, go ahead, drink it.
Right.
I'm saying, I don't really care what you do. Right. If I say, go ahead, fucking drink it.
Right.
Well, I changed the text a little bit, but the subtext is totally different. Now, so that's text and subtext. Context is, we're sitting in a bus. I'm holding a gun. This is a clumsy way. I'm holding a gun, and you're holding poison, and I'm holding your child. So now the context is extremely loaded, and the choice that you're about to make is implicit. And I'm saying, if you don't drink it, I'm going to shoot your baby. So I say, go ahead, drink it. See, the context is the story. The context is a situation you're dealing with. We can come up with a much better, that's just the clumsy off the top of my head kind of thing.
That makes sense.
But the idea is that basically, like, the text is ironically, because writers tend to overemphasize dialogue so much, the text tends to get too much importance. The most important stuff is the context and the subtext, because the subtext is the intention, the context is the conflict that you're dealing with, the situation you're trying to deal with. So if we're in space and we're flying toward the moon, and we know that...
Is this gravity, by the way? Oh, no.
I don't know, I'm just making this up as we go. If we're flying toward the moon, and we know that this is, that the only thing that's gonna save us is this little serum, and it could either boil our blood or it might save our lives, and we've just given up and we've been through this whole journey, and we're about to open the hatch, and I say, go ahead, drink it. Then we open the hatch. It totally changes the whole context. So that the context is about the situation you're dealing with. Subtext is intention. Text is just the artifact. It's one expression of that desire.
Finding the character's voice, one of the mistakes a lot of screenwriters make is that all the characters sound exactly alike.
Well, you want each character to sound unique to themselves. Ideally, if you covered up the character's name and read the line, you would be able to tell that it was that specific character, because they should have a specific voice.
Another thing about dialogue is, think about how dialogue is character-based. It all comes from characters. And if you take a different group of people and have them say things, they're going to say it in different ways. And one of the things that I always use as my example is, I write a lot in Starbucks coffee shops where all the baristas are dressed the same. They all have the same basic dialogue. What will you be having? Room for cream, etc. But each one is an individual, and the spin they put on it, their attitude, comes out through the way they say things. So there is a barista at one of my Starbucks who puts the positive spin on everything. So if you come in and say, I lost my job today, she'll say, great, you can spend more time with your family. No matter how bad your life is, she puts the positive spin on everything. And she is so upbeat and chipper that I just want to kill her. But that's her spin. There is a barista who everything is about himself. So if you come up and say, I want, the tea with 2 shots of melon, he goes, melon's not very good. I like the berry syrup. The berry syrup's better with this drink. And it's like, how has this become about you? No matter what you say, he turns it into his story. And so there are all these people have the same dialogue, the same basic dialogue, but how they say it, with their spin they put on it, shows their character through the same basic dialogue, but the spin on it. And so think about dialogue as being the extension of character, and how we're going to learn about that character through however they say the generic line is this. Now our job as writers is to take the generic line and do the specific to character line. This character thinks this. This character believes that everything is sexual, if you know what I mean. And there's that barista that does that. There's the barista that, no matter what the opposite of the shipper, no matter what you do, it's always a terrible day for them. There's the barista that thinks that everyone's out to get them. It's the paranoid barista. It's like, why are you asking about whether we have, and it's like all these are different characters, and they come out through basically the same pieces of dialogue said in different ways. So think about how the character comes out through dialogue, and that makes it individual and interesting. Instead of saying the normal line, we now have the little spin on the line, which makes it a better line of dialogue.
Hopefully you've created a unique enough character, or a character with a strong enough sense of who they are, or what their, how you would describe that character and what their journey is going to be, emotional journey is going to be, that the words they don't write themselves necessarily, but it's like the track that the train is running on. So you know what the character is about, you know where they're going to go, you know what they're doing right, you know what they're doing wrong, and what you want them to be and how they talk needs to match that basis of who they are.
If you get the note that all your characters sound the same, first of all, you got to look at the attitude. The other things to look at are things like characters' vocabulary, because you don't want all of your characters to have the same vocabulary that you do. Each character has different words for things. Common words are the main thing to look at. The character says yes, no, right, wrong, all the words that pop up again and again, and you need to find the individual way for each character to say things. So one character might say no, another character might say nope, no siree, and these things are, again, character related. You look at the character and go, how would this character say no? And what I usually do is I'll generate a list of yes, no's, true, false, any words that's going to pop up again and again, and then find the one that is that character and go, okay, he's saying it this way. This also comes up with curse words. Can I curse in this?
Oh, you may.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Curse words are one of those things. I found out that my favorite curse word is shit, because I wrote a script, and then when I was reading through it, I found out that whenever anything goes wrong with any of my characters, they open their mouth and shit comes out. And so I thought, that's not possible. They can't all be me. So what I wanted to do is individualize their curse words. So I went through the script and found different ways for them to curse, and each character had their own distinctive curse. And when I came to one of the characters, his name was Carter, I just off the top of my head came up with kitty crap. That's just kitty crap. And when I used kitty crap, I went, this now changes that character into something even better than it was. So I went back and made him, he was a surfer dude, and now I made him a southern surfer dude, which I don't think I've ever seen on screen. And so now he has sort of these weird phrases that are like, down-home phrases and surfer language all at once. And so I thought that makes this a totally individual character. But word choice is one of those things where we each have our different vocabulary, and so that's going to come out. Another thing about dialogue is that we all speak differently. There are characters that, put in a word like, every few words, and like, I don't know, like, and those things, which you use a little sparingly, but nonetheless create a different rhythm for that character. If you look at Yoda, Yoda is the most messed up sentence structure ever because he speaks backwards. But he speaks backwards, and there's memes that are like Yoda memes that have like the backwards Yoda talk. And that's such a distinctive type of dialogue. If you can come up with dialogue like that, there will be people that will write that stuff and you'll know it's Yoda right away. And that's what you want to do, is basically come up with dialogue that has a sentence structure kind of a thing, use of like pet words like or you know, or whatever, a different vocabulary for common words, and also different vocabulary, maybe education has differences. One of the things I love about Elmore Leonard novels is he takes guys who've done a lot of time in prison and they read in prison. So they have vocabularies that are much better than any of the cops because they've had a lot of time to do some reading. So he has these characters who have just like amazing vocabularies who are crooks, which makes them interesting characters. But it makes sense because, you know, a lot of prison time to read. So again, their vocabularies are better than the cops. The thing that I love about when you're reading an Elmore Leonard novel is when he goes to a character, the description part is written in that character's voice. So he just jumps into that character and you're already seeing the world through that character's eyes before we get to them speaking. And it already is in their voice. I don't know what that has to do with anything, but it's cool. If you watched Justified, there's a great example of an educated criminal, because that guy, you know, is the smartest, cleverest, again, clever, a criminal thing, you know, but he's smart, he's clever, he can out-talk people with his amazing vocabulary, which is better than mine, which is another thing. When you're the writer, you don't have to know all these words, you just have to know how to look them up.
I like to talk a lot about contrast. So if you have two characters in the scene, it's really always more interesting if the characters are contrasted. So if a character is speaking in a formal way, so somebody who's an academic or a professor or a doctor and he speaks in a formal way, make sure that the person that he's interacting with speaks in a more slangy way, or, you know, more contracted way, because that's going to make, you're going to create that contrast. You know, just like in painting, if you want to highlight the color blue, you surround it with yellow, right? It's opposite. So it's the same thing with characters. A lot of the techniques in the dialogue chapter in the book are about individuality. How do you create individual voices? Because having all the characters sound the same is a very common problem with dialogue. It's usually the writer's voice, and Sorkin has actually been criticized for that all these characters sound the same. But when I talk about his dialogue and I show clips and actual scripts, I showed that he actually does individualize, and the characters sound different. So it's an unfair criticism, but you have to do that. You know, it helps if there's some, difference in character speech or cadence or contractions versus, stilted writing, grammatically correct writing.
I think what you always want to look for as a writer is if you've got two or more characters in the scene, you want to create a situation where they want opposing things, or because otherwise there's no conflict. Or one way to look at it is every scene is a power grab. Everybody wants to take control of the situation in whatever way that means to them. And so how are they sort of secretly jockeying for position, like he and I do. Like which of us, we're all just worried, we're worried about which of us looks smarter. See, that's what this whole interview has been. The other thing that you said about the desires on the part of the character, I was thinking, I know you said there's a lot more than two, but two more I would think about as the writer, besides, what were the two you said? What does the character
The two different objectives.
Yeah.
Basically what I broke it down, Michael, is what I call the public objective.
Right.
In other words, if I asked, in fact, anybody in this room now, what are you doing here? What do you want? What's your objective right now? And we could talk about, we're doing this interview. That's our public objective. Then there's underneath that, deep underneath, is a private objective, which may not even be recognized.
Well, that's what I was...
It may be in the unconscious. What's driving that character to try to do that?
Right. And one way I would look at it, it's not quite the same as a desire, is to ask, what is the character hiding from the other person consciously? What is she hiding from him, and what is she hiding from herself? What's the thing that she's not yet aware of that is really driving her, and underneath, especially in the first half or 3/4 of the movie. Towards the end, you'd hope that all that would come to the surface. But deception and secrecy are very, very powerful in telling a story because they add a whole new layer of conflict. They get into this inner journey stuff, and the more conflict on the more layers, the more you're going to pull in your audience.
That's good. I like the hiding thing. See, because I was into that, the subconscious or the unconscious or the unaware of, but the hiding and deception and secrecy. That's good. I'm going to steal that. Can I steal that?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
It's yours.
Thank you. No, you can still use it. I mean, I'm not taking it forever.
Oh, okay. You want to share it. You don't want to steal it.
No, I'm not going to stay. Yeah, I'm not going to.
As long as we're clear that my agenda is to look better.
I'll give you credit for it.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Because we know my stated objective is to look smarter. I think we.
Yes, and I'm trying to help you with that.
I appreciate that.
I'll help you think you're winning.
Thank you. Let's move on. That was great. Let's move on.
A lot of writers don't realize, they're so interested in story, and what am I going to do in Act 2 to end it? And instead of thinking of how would this person express themselves in this situation to make me feel that I'm part of this scene, so that I could put myself in their place and feel what they're doing through the words.
I would just add that is what drafting is for, because in one draft you're going to be focused on the story, and then maybe when you've got the story, you're going to look at word choice in another draft, and then you're going to look at the dialogue and really polish the dialogue.
By and large, you write a script, you turn it in, you get notes, and then the notes come with dialogue issues. I don't understand this line. This isn't funnier. Love that line. This works. This doesn't. Could you add a little bit? Put a little twist on it. That's duplicated. That kind of thing. Which is very helpful. And it's all like I look at the scripts as just this big piece of clay that you're constantly molding and shaping, and it's just sort of moving with and trying to find the shape to it, and until you have your the piece of pottery that you're trying to make. It's a lot of changes. They always say writing is rewriting. And that's really, and that's so important. I'm a big believer in rewriting. I'm fine about rewriting as long as it makes sense, and it's not just to do it. Because you do make things better. You can't get it on one fell swoop. At least I can't. You have to write and rewrite and sort of really work on it and really think about it and get some distance from the material too. So that you can sort of look at it with your own fresh eyes, and you have a much better sense of what works and what doesn't work.
One of the best questions you can ask yourself for every single line of dialogue in your scene. So write the dialogue, first draft, just do what you want to do. Don't worry about that. But when you reread the dialogue, ask yourself for every line, why is that character saying this? Why is that character saying that specific line? Most of the time it will be because they're responding to so they're reacting to something, that's fine. But a lot of the times you will find that a character is saying something because you want the character to say that, not because the character wants something in that scene at that specific time. So you got to know what the character wants, and then every line of dialogue is a strategy for that character to get what they want. And if that dialogue is not that, then you rewrite the line until it fits that.
People in the 70s and 80s talk differently in the 90s and the 00s. It's or the 40s, the 50s. It's all very different. But the basic way of communicating, having clear, interesting words that lead you to a particular point, that's always what it is. It's how you get there. It's been a little bit different. And writing anything I've written that's had interestingly, I wrote a Christmas movie for Hallmark a few years ago, and there were flashbacks to the 1920s, and I had to write dialogue that seemed about right for the 1920s, and it was just cadence. It was just being a little bit more formal, a little bit more on the nose maybe with some of the things that were said, and it was fine, and it just, I think it worked, it wasn't about going back and saying, now what word did they use in the 1920s for, automobile, or something. It wasn't that, it was a feeling, it was a texture to the words. So that can be really fun, because we don't exactly know how people talked. Yes, we have movies from back then and we can see, but we're still filtering those things through a contemporary perspective. So it's not going to be quite like it was back then. And you want people to be able to relate to it and understand it.
As a guy with gray in my hair, one of the problems often is my vocabulary is different than current, 15 to 25-year-old vocabulary. And so part of that is you kind of have to remain a little current into what's going on in the world and
Sure.
listen to slang. That there's two theories on slang, and one is to basically keep current with how people are speaking, which whether that is actually going down to the mall with do people go to a mall anymore? That's dated right there, huh?
I think that's
an
80s. That's
thing.
that's Fast
Malls are
Times at
80s.
Ridgemont High.
But anyway, go down to wherever the young people, go down to your skate park,
there you
and
go.
record people and figure out what the slang is. Or the other way to do it is the clueless version, where you create your own slang, because that way, if you create slang for today's youth, then that film's slang doesn't work for tomorrow's youth. It's jeepers, and it's like, it doesn't work. But Clueless decided that they were going to create their own slang so that it would be, even though it doesn't really work because he's totally Baldwin, now has no meaning whatsoever. But basically they created their own slang for that movie, and by creating their own slang, they came up with something that we hadn't heard before. So that also made it more interesting dialogue. But really, if you're a writer and you're writing for today's audience, you have to still know what today's audience sounds like. And that deals with stories as well, just the story concepts, because it's like I know a writer who's my age who is still writing movies for Julie Andrews, and that's never going to happen. It's like you can write for the past, and the past, unless you have a time machine, you can't sell that script. For me, I grew up watching 70s movies, and gritty 70s movies are great, but I don't own a time machine. I can't go, if I wrote one, I can't really go back and sell it. So even though I still might write one of those, just for my own personal, those are tough sales. They do every once in a while pop through, and I think part of that ends up being they're based on a novel. So who is it? Killing Me Softly. What the hell is the name of that?
Roberta Flack. Oh.
No, there's a Brad Pitt movie. And now my memory's all gone. But there's like there was a recent 70s film that was somehow made today. And it was a crime film. It was totally had the gritty feel, had the same sort of a 70s feel, but those are so few and far between. Writing for the wrong time period is a mistake.
Good dialogue writers also have really good ears, and they're listening for the way people speak, and they remember those sorts of things.
Hearing things, writing things down, writing down expressions like, oh my God, what a great expression. What does that mean? I'm going to take that. Or just the dynamic between people, kinds of relationships. Who's talking to who at the supermarket, listening to a couple arguing or being too nice to each other or whatever it is. It's fascinating. I'm always writing things down.
Listening to how people talk, listening to interesting people around, how they talk, and then once you write your dialogue, read it out loud, do a table read with friends or your writer's group, or just even if you read it out loud yourself.
Listening to readings, I find readings incredibly valuable. Workshopping, and films and TV should be done the same way. Actors are not shy about telling you what doesn't work for them. Just like singers are not shy about telling a songwriter, hey, when I land on that, it doesn't go, the words don't go with the notes.
A sort of a simple answer to your question, though, is read your dialogue aloud.
Yes, very good point. I don't do it, but
you can start saying, "Well, that's not coming off my tongue very easily." I don't think I want to ask somebody to say that. When composers compose, and you're writing for an orchestra, and you don't know how to play the French horn, and you can't play the oboe, and quite often after it's done, you have people play through the parts, and they say, "That's unplayable. You can't finger it that way," and they have to go back and they have to change their parts, because they're not writing for that instrument.
Right now, we're reading through the play. My director's dividing the play into beats and sections, and we're really focusing on, after we've read through it all together, now we're focusing on the individual words and to see exactly what's working and what words really don't quite make sense, or what did I have in my mind that the actresses aren't necessarily feeling or getting, or they don't quite know how to say it, or the director isn't sure. And that's an amazing process. It's like a fantastic process. So being able to hone the words It's kind of rare, you know, just doing a table read of your script before something is produced, which doesn't always happen, is really, really helpful. You have to hear other voices other than the ones in your head. You know, you have to hear them say the words.
Have actors read it out loud. I mean, they don't have to be professional actors, but just you and a friend, read it out loud, listen to how it flows. I think that can be really helpful.
People think, for example, that objectivity in the world exists, but it doesn't. If 3 people walk into this room, would they all see the same thing? It's chairs, rug, desk? No. If an interior designer was to walk in this room, they would get nauseous. If a carpenter came in, they'd be looking at the shelves plumb. If a psychologist came in, they'd be looking at the titles of the books. And if a chiropractor came in, they'd be looking at our posture and saying, I see money coming my way, slouching. But the eye doesn't tell the brain what it sees, the brain tells the eyes what to look for. And so,
Interesting, I didn't know that.
And so actors are constantly looking at, when they're seeing any extreme in behavior, they're paying attention to the littlest things. Right. You know, it's not just that his voice raises, but what's he doing with his hands while he's doing it? How has his posture changed? Because he's going to use that. And so again, the same thing, good writers, when they hear people talk, they're saying, did that person get tongue-tied when she got really angry? Or did this whole slew of stuff just come rolling off the tongue? And does this sound like something she said a lot of times? Or is this something that, you know, is she saying it legato or staccato? You know, it's like, I'm so angry at you, I could just bust. Or is it, I'm so angry at you, I could just bust. And you know, all these things, they're listening for these things, saying, wow, listen how the emotion's coming out in everyday people doing stuff. That's the way I want to write the dialogue. So it's, you look at what you're interested in. And if you're a good dialogue writer, you don't just think of what words they're going to say. It's, what have I seen people do when they're trying to demonstrate them, when they're demonstrating that emotion? How do the words come out?
Pay attention to the world around you, and you know, something I watch. I'll watch a movie or something on TV or whatever, and I'll look at like the run of dialogue. It'll just be phenomenal, a phenomenal speech, you know, and by, you know, phenomenal piece of dialogue. You know, I loved The Newsroom, the Aaron Sorkin show, the HBO show, and you know, I would literally just look at just play back over and over the certain sections of that show and the way that dialogue was constructed. And you know, he's such a genius in terms of constructing dialogue and the words that he has as people use. But you can learn so much from that. You can be so inspired and then put your own voice into that kind of thing. And again, a lot of writing dialogue is cadence and personality and things like that. And trying to have characters sound different, you know, so that not every character sounds exactly the same. You know, you give every character their own voice, which is tricky. It's hard to do, but that's also really important. And you have to create you have to create character, you know, beneath, you know, character that's kind of driving that dialogue for that, even if it's just a supporting character, somebody we don't see very much. But yeah, you gotta pay attention to what's around you. It's, you know, the best things are out of reality.
When you are doing a very contained, like a low budget, that has a lot to do with it too, because a lot of times the people are sitting and talking, right? You're in a room, you're in a house or whatever, and so they're sitting and talking. But I think making sure that pacing is good, so it just doesn't feel like really, you know, people just explaining things. That's kind of the death of people's dialogue, is when people over-explain and they don't know how to sort of weave in that exposition kind of nicely. Then it really just kind of like hangs there. That's not good writing.
I think the biggest mistake is over-explaining and not knowing how to tunnel the background of the story into the story instead of laying it out. Like, we just developed a brilliant screenplay for the last several years in which the opening conversation just is not convincing because there is no other explanation for the words in the conversation other than explaining to the audience what's going on. And that's a hard to avoid mistake, because you know you've got to explain what's going on. But if you do it overtly, the audience is going to not believe the dialogue. They're not going to believe, they're going to not be able to suspend their disbelief. So you have to sneak these things into the story at times when they're needed, and not too much too soon. One of the common mistakes, I think the root mistake beneath that mistake is thinking that the audience is not as smart as they are. It's looking down on your audience.
There's ways to make sure the exposition in your dialogue matches the objective. For example, if I'm suspected of murder and you're the detective who's asking me questions, right? And tell me, where were you? And I didn't commit the murder. Well, whatever I'm going to say is my desire to make you think I didn't do the murder. So there's a reason why I'm saying that line. I didn't do it. I was at the movies. Saying at the movies is exposition, but it's connected to my desire to convince you that I was not the killer. You see? So the exposition matches the objective of the character. So there's ways to do this. There's plenty, there's techniques to make sure the exposition is subtle, part of conflict, part of your desire line, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff you could do. But that's the lesson you really have to know. That's the most important thing. Make sure you know what every character wants in the scene. Make sure that what they say matches that objective. So I always bring out David Mamet, who's genius at dialogue, and he said once, nobody says anything unless they want something. So unless you want something, nobody says anything, because nobody's going to say, hey, I'm a trustworthy character, right? I mean, if somebody said that to you, you're going to be thinking, whoa, why is he telling me this, right? There's always a reason. Why? So there's always a reason. And if we know what the reason is in the movie, if you know what the character wants, or you're trying to figure out what the character wants, that's more interesting than somebody dumping exposition. Characters who just dump exposition, it's just boring because it's not connected to a desire line. Even characters who disagree with each other, even though that might be kind of interesting because there's some tension there, if we don't know what they want, it's going to be boring. So you see this a lot with amateur scenes of people like, oh, I need conflict, so my character is just going to argue, and so you have the people arguing back and forth, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just right because we don't know what they want. And that's really what makes something interesting, is intention and obstacle to that.
On the nose dialogue could be one of the worst. I like to say sometimes that talking heads dialogue, where it's just two characters talking to each other, kind of at each other, and then Q&A sessions are the worst, and that's where one character keeps asking another questions and then they just keep answering it. So it's almost like an interview. And if that goes on for too long, it really tires out the reader and it just gets really what we call on the nose.
What makes scripts awful is when characters tell you everything. So examples, if a husband and a wife, let's say a wife saw her husband having lunch with another woman that she didn't know about, and he comes home from work, he's like, hi honey, how's your day? And she were to say, what she'll probably say in real life is nothing, with that kind of, I mean, Matthew Weiner's a master of like, subtext, and I recommend looking at just about any episode of Mad Men, but much less interesting. So, or she might say that the husband comes in and says, what did you do today? And I was in a similar situation once and I did not say, I saw you with another woman having lunch today. I wanted him to I wanted to maybe catch him in a lie. I said, or actually what did you do today? And he said, nothing special. Really? Did you have lunch somewhere interesting? What are you talking about? And maybe one of the things that I love is that if you really play along with that, you can also play with the audience in terms of them thinking, oh yeah, he was having an affair. Then we find out that it was an interior decorator and he was surprising his wife he just bought a little vacation home. and he was making sure, or he just like was renting in Malibu a place and he wanted to make sure all the stuff was special for their anniversary. And then what can happen is if she keeps testing him and she like starts bringing up old stuff about how he pisses her off, that scene could end with him not telling her what the surprise was and the couple deciding, you never trust me, you know what, I was going to do something nice for you and screw you, I want a divorce. I'm just spinning here and I'm not saying that that's, you know, the greatest scene, but that's an example of when you play with subtext versus characters saying everything that they're thinking. Another example, if you take Streetcar Named Desire with Blanche and Stanley and Stella, and if you had Blanche saying, well, I really have been working as a prostitute and I'm depressed and I have nowhere else to live. Game over, like not very interesting. So if you think about it in those terms, yeah, it's, and it's really reflecting how people are in real life. People don't always say exactly what they're thinking and feeling.
You find that when you start writing dialogue, sometimes the characters talk differently than you'd expect. That evolves, you know, and that can be very interesting. And sometimes your character changes as a result of your dialogue. But by and large, you know, we're using our voices, we're using voices of people we know, we're using cadences, we're using regional, you know, words. You know, it's a combination of a lot of things, but it does, in a way, it does write itself. You know, you're the driver, but you know, it does kind of roll out. But again, a dialogue, you know, it's about how do you write natural dialogue? How do you write the way people really speak? And it's cadence, and it's simplicity of words. It's you know, saying the most amount of ideas and the least amount of letters, basically, the least amount of words, and to keep it all moving forward.
There's this thing that I call bumper stick. Actually, I don't call it. Patrick Shane Duncan, who wrote Courage Under Fire and Mr. Holland's Opus, calls it bumper sticker dialogue. And so what it is he wrote, he did some rewrite work on a Chuck Norris movie, and he didn't get credit on screen, but everyone has the bumper sticker that says, if I want your opinion, I beat it out of you. And he wrote that line. And so if you come up with those lines, go ahead, make my day, you know, and all those things that'll end up on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt, you know, those are the gold we're looking for. And in the film noir class I did, Out of the Past just has line after line after line that you go, you could engrave that on a bar of gold and it would increase the value. And you know, if we can come up with those lines that are clever that people remember,